Welcome to Business Talk with Meghan McNulty, the podcast that takes you behind the scenes of business success and reveals the strategies, insights, and stories that drive these professionals to thrive in the ever-evolving world of business. Whether you're an established entrepreneur, a seasoned business owner, or simply fascinated by the world of commerce, this podcast is your front row seat to learn from the best. Each episode, Meghan will bring you engaging interviews with professionals from diverse industries who will share their triumphs, lessons learned, and the insights they've gained along the way.
Hey, Brandon, how's it going?
It's going well, Meghan. It's nice to hear your voice, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming back on. We wanted to talk to you because there's a lot of changes now since we know who the next president is going to be, and the Trump administration is in the middle of their transition. So I was hoping you could answer some questions or give us some insights on your experience with this, since you are running Freedom Research Foundation and have a global presence and been all over the world. So if you don't mind, can I get started and ask you a few questions? Or if you'd like to say something first, that's fine too.
No, absolutely. I mean, the one thing that I would say, just a little bit about Freedom Research Foundation and my father, is that, as you know, he knew President Reagan personally, and I grew up in Washington, D.C., and Freedom Research Foundation was a platform used to be able to conduct research and advise, former director of the CIA, Bill Casey, and Konstantin Mingus, who was the agency's guy on the NSC, as well as the president, on how to dismantle the Soviet Union. So understanding, the politics of Washington, D.C. is not only kind of part of my family, but it's embedded in the history of the organization, which I run now.
Amazing. Okay, so my first question is basically kind of the transition implication. So how does the shift in administration, especially following Trump's policies, which we know about, typically impact national security priorities, and what financial ripple effects might Americans feel as a result?
Yeah, no, I think from a financial standpoint, we've already seen huge response from the markets, seeing that they're very positive about a Trump administration and what that's going to mean. The dollar's strengthened as well. So, that gives pluses and minuses when it comes to American business. Obviously, it makes it more powerful to buy things and a little bit more challenging to sell things. But overall, the reality is we're already seeing the effects of even the guarantee of a Trump administration. I think from a national security administrative standpoint, what's really important to understand is that Trump had 4 years to learn how the U.S. government either functioned or doesn't function. And I think that he's taking that experience, and now he's looking to emplace people that he knows understand the problems of the institutions they're running, and then developing policies alongside those. And I was asked a question tonight from somebody who's doing business in Ukraine, and he was asking if it's a foregone conclusion that, Trump's going to leave Ukraine. And I said, quite frankly, I think what Trump is going to look at for his administration, his cabinet, is to say, look, we've spent a lot of money in Ukraine, and there are a lot of resources there, and there is nothing wrong at all with making sure that the American taxpayers who paid for supporting the sovereignty of a country like Ukraine should have, the first seat in line to rebuild the country, make deals for oil and gas, make deals for minerals at a minimum to cover the expense that has already been made. So I think we're going to see national security being aligned with economic prosperity for America, and I think that's the right direction to go in.
Do you think the national security priorities are going to change now that we have a new administration, or do you think they'll stay the same? Is national security basically kind of, immune from different sides of the aisle, or?
No, they're going to shift dramatically. I mean, I think that there has been a lot of confusion, not only around the world, but also amongst Americans. What are the things we're spending money on and the policies that we have as a nation don't seem to align with, our way of life and the things that we believe. It didn't really make sense. So I think what you're going to see is that Trump's going to ask himself and his cabinet's going to ask them a couple of questions. Number one, how is this good for America and why should we be involved here? And if we're going to be involved here, how do we make it, profitable? And I think that this notion that somehow that's a bad thing is ridiculous. And if the American taxpayers are going to pay for it, then they should be benefiting from it, not only from a stability security perspective, but also from a financial perspective. And there's just nothing wrong with it. It's just not the way things have been done. So I think you're going to see, a double down on supporting Israel, a focus on, creating a much more equal playing field when it comes to international economics, when we've seen nation states taking advantage of different circumstances, which I think we're going to talk about here shortly. Yeah, I think the priorities are going to change significantly, and they're going to be clear. There's going to be no ambiguity about what is a Trump administration doing and why they're doing it.
So let's kind of circle back here to national security spending. Do you see them changing what they're spending, where they're spending money? How might that influence our taxes?
Yeah, I certainly hope so. I certainly hope that the days, and I do believe that, the Defense Department will drastically start cutting all of the unnecessary spending that's occurred. And part of the reason why this happened was during the 9/11, post 9/11 period, generals who weren't solving problems just coming back to Congress saying, we need more money, we need more money. And of course, everybody who is a patriot wanted to support the military, and so they just gave them whatever they needed. But the more money never resulted in better outcomes. So the problem was not money. That was just the excuse they were giving Congress and therefore the American people for being unsuccessful. And the reality is what you need is not a bigger, more expensive military. What you need is a more efficient, more cost-effective military with better informed people who know what they're doing. Those people are out there, but usually they get sidelined by bureaucrats who don't know what they're doing because they threaten the status quo, and they don't want to threaten the status quo. They want a military and a DoD budget where every year all they think about is how can I spend all of the money. That's why the budget keeps going up and up and up and up and up and up, and nobody goes back and looks and says, well, wait a minute, what did we need the money for? Did we spend it effectively? And if we did, then we should just lower the budget. No, they keep spending. They literally think, okay, if I don't spend all the money, then I'm not going to get it next year. So they will literally go to all costs to try to spend every single dollar that they're allocated, and then it just becomes fraud, waste, and abuse at a catastrophic scale. So I think that's going to change. It needs to change. You're not a patriot just because you don't want bureaucrats wasting your money. No, they have an obligation to prove that they're being effective and efficient with the money that you give them. That's their responsibility to the American people. And I think that the trust between the government and the DoD and the American people has been broken.
Oh, I agree. I think people definitely feel that way. So in terms of trade relationships, how might that affect Americans' cost of living, and what role does the national security play in stabilizing or disrupting these economic factors, such as the foreign policy and Trump's talk on tariffs and whatnot?
Yeah, I think, a lot of people are speaking about tariffs in a very linear way, right? And they're saying, okay, Trump's going to create tariffs, and then that's going to raise the cost of goods, and then the American people are going to have to pay for those goods. And that is not what Trump's doing. Trump is doing something that's actually really brilliant, and he's doing three things at one time. Because part of what tariffs does, right, is when you have an actor in economics who is using circumstances in order to take advantage of the economies of scale, right? So cheap labor, exploit resources from nation states in Africa where they're just taking natural resources basically at, cost. And then they're using those in order to produce goods and then sell them in the United States. there's no reasonable way that the rest of the world can compete with that when you're using things you stole and slave labor, right? So what Trump's doing is he's trying to create an equal economic playing field. And by doing so, he's doing two other things. He's creating a demand for other markets in Southeast Asia or the rest of the world that can produce goods to compete, because now they have slave labor and resources they're stealing from other countries to have a cheaper cost. But also he's forcing Americans to start to produce things in the U.S. And so ultimately, we know that the American economic machine is the greatest economic system in the existence of human civilization. And so they're going to be able to solve these kind of issues by becoming more cost effective and identifying what the real cost of goods are, because they're going to be able to compete on a more equal playing field. And so it's a brilliant move. And the people who are saying, oh, this is going to be terrible, are the same people that said, he wasn't getting elected, or that, the economy was great under Biden. I mean, you just can't believe them.
Right. I know. I also heard that like what you just said, it'll force some of these companies to keep production in the U.S. as well. And that'll keep up, that'll improve our jobs and inflation and whatnot. Okay, so what about cybersecurity? So with growing cybersecurity threats, how might changes in cyber defense funding or strategy with the new administration impact businesses? And by extension, consumers like me?
It's a really good question, but it also goes back to everything that we're seeing about how Trump and the Trump administration is talking about government, right? So when we think about government, we think of this thing that is, out there that we have to pay for and makes decisions that we have to then follow. But what we continue to forget is that the government works for us, and the people who get paid government salaries work for the American people. And they are Americans, but somehow they work in government long enough, they forget that they're actually one of us, and they're actually supposed to be doing something responsible with the money that we pay them for. And so the reason why this goes back to cybersecurity is that the government is never good at solving problems. They're only good at creating problems. But what they should be doing is creating space for the private sector to solve problems, like the Elon Musks of the world and the Vakes of the world, who were successful or are successful businessmen who all they have been able to do in life is create wealth by solving problems. And that's the antithesis of government. The government consumes wealth and creates problems. The private sector creates wealth and solves problems. So what we're going to see in the Trump administration, I think, and particularly when it comes to cybersecurity, because it is important, is that we're going to see the Trump administration setting conditions for the private sector to deliver security services and training and people for the industry to make economies and our financial systems more secure. And they're going to create space and opportunity for that. And they're going to incentivize the private sector to solve these problems.
Exciting. Supply chain security. So what do you think the government's doing to ensure the stability and security of our supply chain that's critical to American consumers, especially our pharmaceuticals, which are often being made overseas, in China, Mexico, other places?
I mean, this is where there has to be a very focused discussion between economics and national security. And I think this is probably already happening, but will continue to happen, which is that, when you have a free market like America, we want the best people to compete for the best jobs, and we want the best companies to compete for the best services. The problem is when you have nation states who are, exploiting natural resources in cobalt by, bribing government officials and then sending prisoners from their country to go do mining. That's not a free market. That's not fair competition. And what also happens is that from a business perspective, American business just looks at the cost of goods and they're like, oh, well, it's just cheaper to do that. Well, we've learned now with the, shortage of, certain types of computer chips and, things that were being made in China during COVID, that it's not as simple as just buying the cheapest thing. And if we continue to do that, we're going to have we're going to suffer second and third order consequences that we saw during these last couple of years. So aligning our national security interests with economies of scale and promoting American businesses to go compete in nation states that are being exploited by countries like China, Russia, and others. We have an amazing amount of resources. We have amazing amount of companies, small, medium, and large. So leveraging the Defense Finance Corporation, U.S. Trade Development Agency, and the Department of Commerce as platforms to give American companies seats at a table for any negotiation anywhere in the world. Every ambassador and the Secretary of State should be thinking from an economic perspective working for Trump. If I'm working in an embassy, how am I promoting American business today, not only to be profitable to the American economy and to the American people who pay my salary, but also from a national security standpoint, because if an American company doesn't get that contract or isn't doing that business, then a China, Russia, or another nation state will, and that can hurt our national security. So I think that's the direction that supply chain is going to go. And I think we're going to be a much better off for it, and not just us, but the rest of the world.
Right. I might be misspeaking because I'm not an expert on oil, but it's interesting to me that parts of Europe get their oil from Russia, right? Well, how come we don't sell Germany oil? I find it strange that sometimes we don't take advantage of these markets where we could be selling our products and helping American businesses.
Yeah, so remember that under Trump's last administration, the U.S. was the largest oil producer in the world, and we were a net exporter. So we were exporting excess oil and gas, and we hadn't depleted our national reserves like Biden forced us to do under his administration, out of some misguided concept that he was being greener. It didn't make any sense, and it really made the American people suffer. But remember, it's not just the natural resource itself, right? Our oil and gas industry, everything from, the oil and gas companies, the rigs, the roughnecks who work on the oil and gas rigs, have the ability to bring a level of quality and service and capacity, refinement, delivery, petrochemical development, all of these things that we can do around the world, we should be doing all around the world. And we should be doing it with the help and the support of the U.S. government. So in some cases, it may be cost effective to sell our oil and gas to places in Europe or other places around the world, and it may not be. But that isn't the only thing that we're good at doing. In fact, we're the best in the world at developing oil and gas anywhere in the world. The issue is the government has to take a position where the Department of Energy, the Department of State, the Department of Defense, under the guidance of the president, making this a priority and using every single embassy as a platform for us to go to these countries and delivering these services at best in class at the best cost.
I always also wonder, I read something else about how a lot of our medical devices and antibiotics are not produced in the United States. They're produced overseas. And there's been lots of congressmen and senators that have said, hey, we need to bring it back here in case there is a national security threat or we do go to war with one of these countries, and they cut off our supply of antibiotics, let's just say. In that case, I'm just I pretend I'm just not educated to understand this. Let's just say we did go to war with China and they cut off a special antibiotic that a lot of Americans are on that we needed. What happens then? Can we get the antibiotic? Do we start to have to mass producing it here, even though we aren't set up to do that? I mean, I would think that more people would be concerned about that.
They should be. And you're exactly right, by the way. It is a threat. And, COVID taught us this. It's not theory. We live this thing, right? So, Trump never apologized for the fact that he identified that, this virus was made in a lab in China and it was funded by the U.S. government. I mean, it's unbelievable that this was the circumstance. And then, we had these vaccines, which, I, being a former Marine and got tons of vaccines, was naive enough to think it wasn't a big deal. And come to find out, it's absolutely terrible for you. And people suffered immense consequences from taking the vaccine, So I think that we as a nation have a moral and social responsibility to produce these things in the U.S. And it doesn't mean every single part of it needs to be produced in the U.S., but you can produce certain parts of it in different parts of the world and assemble it in the U.S., but we need to think about how are we going to secure our population and how are we going to secure our fighting force. Imagine that we needed some kind of vaccine for whatever, and then all of a sudden our entire military isn't capable of fighting because they don't have it. And this was a real concern during COVID that people didn't talk about. So biological warfare, which is basically what COVID was, is a real thing. Whether it was deliberate or accidental, to me, is irrelevant because the consequences were catastrophic, and we need to learn from that mistake. So you're absolutely right, and I think there should be legislation behind this.
Yeah, it's definitely a new, I think, area, and it's interesting. Trump has appointed Kristi Noem, who's the governor of South Dakota, to Homeland Security, Director of Homeland Security. And she is, obviously a Republican, but is quoted on record stating that she would never say that a mandated vaccine, should never prevent businesses or American companies by saying that it's mandatory. So there is a lot of new territory when it comes to, can you mandate vaccines on Americans? Can companies mandate them? Is it wrong that our country is not manufacturing these drugs here that might become necessary if there is bioterrorism? So it's going to be a whole new thing that hopefully the Trump administration is focused on, because it sounds like it's going to be a major future problem, and it'll be interesting to see what Kristi Noem comes up with in her new role. And it seems like her policies, even though, people would assume maybe she's going to go far to the right, she is actually very, shares a lot of strong beliefs about that with the majority of Americans and the left. So it'll be interesting.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, one thing that people need to consider is that it's not just that Trump is bringing in a bunch of loyalists or people that, he likes or whatever. The government is absolutely massive with millions and millions of people. And, yes, there needs to be coordination amongst the departments of government, but it is too big and too complicated for a single person to direct its entire movement. So he needs people in government who think the way he does. And he's bringing people in that he knows who believe in the same things that he believes in, that he's known for a long time. He's had conversations with them. So he knows when they're the head of a department of government that they're out there executing his vision and his policy for the country, which is what the American people voted for. So, I think this is really important to understand. He is trying to do for the American people what he promised. And I think that it's an exciting time, and I think that we're going to see some huge changes in the country.
Yeah, it should be extremely interesting, and hopefully very pro-business and pro-Americans who are invested in the stock market, that they will see, that influence on their bottom line. And then also, interestingly enough, though, I do think that what we talked about today, which is, the national security implications, they are coming home. A lot of times people didn't think about national security. They just figure the U.S. military and the government's taking care of it. But it hit home for many people when we did have COVID in 2020, and we saw the changes across the world and how that had a major impact on everybody's lives. So hopefully with this new transition, everything stays stable or gets even better than it has been. And I'm excited to see how it goes. So, Brandon, another question is I know that you travel and are living in different parts of the world. What is the attitude in other countries about this? Are people nervous about the fact that we have a new administration in the United States? Does no one notice? What is the overall feelings out there? The vibe, I guess some people would say.
I will tell you that my experience has been everywhere from the Middle East to Europe to Africa, that everybody is on pins and needles to see what a Trump administration is going to do around the world. And yeah. I think that one of the biggest concerns is this insulationist kind of narrative that comes out of America and Washington. And I think that that's the wrong answer. The American dream, the American ideology of freedom. I don't think, the narrative should be no more troops, no more money. It's not necessary. You need a better understanding, and you need economics. And we can defeat our enemies quite easily if we do it that way.
Actually, so I have one last question, if you don't mind, which you saying that sparked this. What do you think? There's a big section of the Republican Party that does not want to be involved in NATO and does want to withdraw and become more concerned with just what's happening on our homeland and not with other countries. What would you tell them as your experience on why that maybe they shouldn't feel that way and we should be more involved overseas?
Look, once again, I think it's important to make a distinction between doing something and then doing something really poorly and then doing something very well. And engaging, with NATO or overseas, it's not just if you do it, you're going to fail. If you do it, you have to waste money. If you have to do it, you're going to do it in a way that actually doesn't make us any more free. Those weren't the only options. And I think the tragedy to that is, Americans have lost faith and confidence in our military-industrial complex and our national security because the government has failed them for so long. But I do believe under the Trump administration, and I do believe that by engaging partners with, commitment and belief, Trump made pay them fair and made them do certain things that they didn't want to do. But they did it, they respected America, and they were better for it, and we were better for it. So I hope those are the big decisions that are made by this administration.
Well, it's really exciting to see what's going to happen, and hopefully it'll be better for the United States and other countries, and we won't have as much turmoil that we've seen in this past year.
Yeah, I think that can be guaranteed for sure.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And is there anything else you'd like to leave us with?
Since Ronald Reagan, and I remember when he left office, I have not been this excited about an administration or the American government. I think this election reinstilled my confidence in the American people and the spirit of what it means to be American. And I'm incredibly excited and more optimistic than I have ever been about the future of America. So I have high expectations, and I think every American should have them too. And I think we should all be excited about where the future takes us.
Me too. I agree with everything that you just said. Okay, well, thank you, Brandon.
All right. Thank you, Megan.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to the Business Talk podcast and leaving us a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback helps us grow and improve. Thank you for joining us today. This has been another episode of Business Talk with Meghan McNulty.